Who's gonna turn it off?
Brother.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're ready to start?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم وعنده مفاتح الغيب لا يعلمها إلا هو ويعلم ما في البر والبحر وما تسقط من ورقة إلا يعلمها ولا حبة في ظلمات الأرض ولا رطب ولا يابس إلا في كتاب مبين. So last time we spoke about the Sirah, which was many weeks ago. We spoke about the Battle of the Ditch, also known as the Battle of the Ahzab. And we talked about how it was a siege against the city of Medina, or the nation state of Medina, to be consistent with the terminology that we're using. And that this took place, it took about a month, and this was in the 5th year of the Hijrah. One of the outcomes of the Battle of the Ditch is that there was a major breach of the Medina constitution by the Jews of Banu Qurayza. And that is what we will discuss today. And it's somewhat of a heavy topic, so I just want to maybe make a few introductory remarks to remind ourselves of the dynamics at play. So we talked about many classes ago when the Prophet ﷺ came to Medina, how he established what we call Wathiqatul Medina, what we translate as the Constitution of Medina. It's not called constitution in the Islamic literature, but we call it that, which was essentially a social contract that made up the nation of Medina. The Ummah of Medina is the word that the Prophet ﷺ used. And in this constitution, there was defined the borders, all of the rights of the citizens, common source of law, freedom of movement, freedom of belief. It was a plural state. And most importantly, that all of the tribes that signed this document, meaning all of the Muhajirun from Mecca, the Aus and the Khazraj, the Muslims amongst them and the non-Muslims amongst them, as well as about 19 to 20 Jewish tribes, all signed this document. They all agreed. And the main clause that bound them together is that if any one of them were to be attacked, it would be an attack on the whole community. And therefore all of them would have to raise arms to defend the state, to defend the homeland. Now, the Jews of Banu Qurayza, they unfortunately started to reach out to the tribe of Ghatafan, which was one of the delegations that came on behalf of the Qurayshis from Mecca to lay siege to Medina. So they colluded with them, they were sending information, they were giving them locations of strategic locations inside Medina, for example, where munitions were, where food and grain were, where the women and children were, etc. So this was a treason of the highest order during a time of war. Okay, to use our language. So after the Prophet ﷺ negotiated or was able to diffuse the tension of the Battle of the Ditch and specifically of Ghatafan, immediately following that, the Prophet ﷺ took his people to go to Banu Qurayza to deal with that situation. Okay, so this is sort of the background to what we are going to discuss. So the Prophet ﷺ, after the tribes that had laid siege to Medina left, immediately the Prophet ﷺ told the companions to go to Qurayza, and he said in what is a very famous statement, and if you're a student of Sharia, everyone knows this hadith and everyone knows this story, that the Prophet ﷺ said, do not pray Asr prayer until you arrive at Banu Qurayza. لا تصلين العصر إلا عند بني قريظة. And the reason that this hadith is so important from a fiqhi point of view is what ended up happening is that there were two groups of the companions that left. One group of the companions that left to go to Bani Qurayza, they stopped on the way and they prayed Asr prayer. Because had they continued to Bani Qurayza, they would have missed Asr prayer. A second group, they said, no, we're not going to stop with you because the Prophet ﷺ said, do not pray until you reach physically Bani Qurayza. So they delayed their Asr prayer. Maghrib came in, they missed Asr prayer, and when they arrived, they prayed Asr Qada. So this is why this hadith, all Sharia students know this, because this is the hadith that introduces the idea of ijtihad and interpretation. So when the Prophet ﷺ arrived, they asked him, both groups, who is correct? And then the Prophet ﷺ acknowledged that both of their interpretations were correct, because the Prophet ﷺ's instructions could have been interpreted either way. Either the Prophet ﷺ meant hurry up and go, so I'm telling you, get going, but of course when Asr time comes in, stop and pray. Or you could also interpret it to mean, I'm telling you specifically in this specific situation, do not pray Asr until you arrive at Bani Qurayza, even if the time has left. And if you understand this story, if you can understand how the Arabic can handle both meanings, you can then extrapolate how many verses in the Quran and how many hadith spoken by the Prophet ﷺ can handle multiple meanings. Okay, so this is why this story is very important when we talk about ijtihad, independent legal reasoning, when we talk about interpretation, when we talk about words having multiple meanings, etc. And the examples are so many. This is the entire business of the Sharia. So this was the incident during which the Prophet ﷺ said this famous hadith. So that's just a little bit of a tangent, but it's important because you will find this hadith frequently quoted in the books of Islamic law. There were about 3,000 Muslims and 30 horses, and they went, and Bani Qurayza, the reason, by the way, we refer to the Wathiqa of Medina as a constitution, and we refer to it as a nation state, Medina as a nation state, is that this place, this tribe, Bani Qurayza, it was not contiguous with the downtown area of Medina. See, the Prophet had to travel to go there, and it was its own city. So the Prophet with the 3,000 men and the 30 horses, he basically surrounded the city. So when we say Medina, in this context of the Sirah, we are talking about what we would refer to today as a country or a nation that has boundaries and is dispersed and has different populations within it. When we say Medina, we are not only talking about what we know today as the Mosque of the Prophet ﷺ and the surrounding areas. We're not just talking about that. We're talking about something that is larger than that. So when the Sahaba left the downtown area of Medina, and the group that didn't pray Asr prayer on the way, they missed it. That's how far the distance is to tell you, give you an idea why we refer to it as a nation, and why we are justified in understanding that. That's very significant, especially for what we are about to say today, and indeed all of the Medina period. But when I get to what happens, I think people will understand. The other thing I want to say also at the outset is that this is not about an essential difference between Islam and Judaism. So the Jews are not, the sworn enemies of Islam, and Muslims are not the sworn enemies of the Jews. This is about a specific Jewish tribe that conducted itself in a specific way at a specific time. And what happens here is because of the crime of treason during the time of war. It has nothing to do with religion. And the proof is that there were Jews that lived in Medina until the final day of the Prophet's life. So this has nothing to do with this essential idea of Islam and Judaism. So we must understand that. It just happens that this tribe is Jewish. Okay? The Prophet is outside the walls. The Jews inside are concerned now, because this is a big force of 3,000 people. So the Prophet ﷺ, he sends one of the companions. His name is Abu Lubaba, radiallahu anhu. Abu Lubaba, he used to have financial dealings with Bani Qurayza, and his trade is there. So he's a known entity. So they allow him into the walls of the city, And when they see him, they're relieved because they see a familiar face. And when he sees them and he sees the stress and the anxiety that they are feeling and experiencing, he softens towards them. So the leader of Bani Qurayza, Ka'b ibn Asad, he asks Abu Lubaba, what's going to happen? What is the Prophet ﷺ, going to do? So Abu Lubaba went like this with his, like it's going to be bad. You guys, you did something really bad. And the minute he did that, he felt that he had violated the trust that the Prophet ﷺ placed in him. So he left the city. He didn't even go back to the Prophet ﷺ. He rode straight back to Medina, and he tied himself to one of the pillars in the mosque. And he said, I am not going to untie myself until the Prophet ﷺ himself comes, gives me his forgiveness, and unties me with his own blessed hand. So he felt that, he was there to negotiate or there to represent the Prophet ﷺ, not to, divulge this or to divulge that. And we will talk about what happens to him. Actually, there are verses that are revealed in relation to this incident. But when the Prophet ﷺ heard this, he said, if he had just come to me, I would have forgiven him. But now he made this theater, so now we have to wait to see what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will do with him. So he made it, in other words, it is a big deal, but had he come repentant to the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet, he is the Prophet of mercy and beauty, he would have forgiven him. He would have understood, and he understands that there was this relation, between Abu Lubaba and the people of Qurayza. But now that he made it so public, the Prophet ﷺ said, now we need revelation to deal with. So we'll come back in a few steps what happens to Abu Lubaba. So remember, all of what we're going to say, Abu Lubaba is tied up in the mosque, in the pillar, in the mosque in Medina, literally. And there was just an older woman, who would untie him when it was time to pray. He would pray the Jama'ah, and then he would go back and she would tie him up. Okay, this lasted for almost a week. The Prophet ﷺ, he essentially lays siege to the city. So now the gates are closed, nothing is getting in, but also nothing is getting out. The people of Qurayza, they had a lot of resources. So had they wanted, they could have probably lasted inside the walls of the city for up to a year. They had enough supplies, they have their own source of water, they have their own food that is stored, they have livestock. They could have lasted. Keep in mind that the Prophet ﷺ has very little resources because they just went through this battle of the ditch that lasted a month. So this is in the tail end of what happened. So the Prophet ﷺ, he might have this show of force, but in a sense, he's outnumbered, he's outgunned, we would say in English, out-resourced. But despite all of that, despite the fact that Qurayza is in a point of advantage with resources and all of that, and they're inside and the Prophet's on the outside, despite all of that, they cave in because psychologically they can't overcome the fear. They're too scared. And there is a hadith in which a part of a hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ, he says, one of the things that he was given that was not given to people before him is that he was given victory through fear, like this. Meaning people when they read this hadith, they think that means we're supposed to be scary. There are people that think like that. That's not what the hadith means. The hadith means like this incident that the Prophet ﷺ didn't have to shed any blood because they were too scared. Even though they were the Prophet ﷺ was outnumbered, the underdog, but yet just him showing up like that, the other people caved in. That's what that hadith means, or it's a very beautiful hadith. There are several khasa'is, special traits that the Prophet ﷺ was given that those before him were not given. Okay, so that's what I cite that because we come across that in our literature. So Bani Qurayza, they capitulate right away. They're like, okay, we can't live like this. It's too much on our nerves. So the Prophet ﷺ decides to send Sa'd ibn Mu'adh radiallahu anhu, who was from the people of Aus. So he was a Madinese Muslim, but from the tribe of Aus. And the Aus were the allies of Bani Qurayza, before Islam. Sa'd radiallahu anhu was injured. He got injured during the Battle of the Ditch. And ultimately, after this episode, Sa'd radiallahu anhu succumbs to his injuries and he dies in Medina. And when he dies, the Prophet ﷺ says the throne of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shook when Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh died. So he was one of the great Sahaba radiallahu anhu. So Sa'ad, he gets this message. Remember, there's this distance that's going on. He gets the message. He comes to the tribe of Bani Qurayza and injured. And the Prophet ﷺ says, you need to go and deal with them. And he said, what I say will happen. And the Prophet ﷺ said, he said, so what I say they have to do? The Prophet ﷺ says, yes. And he says, what I say you will agree? He said, yeah, you're in charge. We give you this issue. All right? So Sa'd rules that the men should be killed. Meaning those that have been proven to have taken up arms against the nation and have sold secrets or colluded with the enemy at a time of war. And the reason I use these sentences and these words is that this is essentially a legal proceeding. You know, the Prophet ﷺ could have, they could have bombarded the city, they could have done this, they could have done that. He didn't. He allowed them the opportunity as citizens of Medina to follow the agreed upon source of law in the nation state, which was what the Prophet ﷺ and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed. So in the constitution of Medina, if there was an issue, it says, فَمَرَدُهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ. So if there's a legal dispute, we will refer it back to Allah and His Prophet. So what do we understand is, today we say that's, we know what the law is. So when you go to court, you're supposed to have an idea of what's going to happen and what the law says and how to defend yourself or how to, bring a lawsuit against somebody else. It can't be blank or anything can happen. You have to have some sense of what's happening. So the Prophet ﷺ allows Sa'd for the relationship that they have, so lest somebody says in the future that, a foreigner passed judgment on us. This is somebody that knows, that has a tribal relationship with the people of Qurayza, and this is what he rules. And then the Prophet ﷺ said, this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Prophet would have ruled with, meaning that He confirms this decree. And by the way, the Prophet ﷺ beforehand had offered them another alternative. He had offered them that they could have become Muslim. Now, when you read that in the Sirah, and you take that out of context, you can make this is where misinterpretation comes from. When the Prophet ﷺ offers them that, he is saying the only way that we can coexist with you is if you adopt our faith and then live amongst us, with us, not amongst us separated with another loyalty, because you have proven untrustworthy. But they refused, they refused that, and then they're free to refuse, but then they have to pay the consequence. They have to pay the price for that refusal. So that would have been another option. So when you read that, that doesn't mean that this is like coercion of becoming a Muslim because they're Jews and Jews are bad. Because there are other Jews, many other Jewish tribes that the Prophet ﷺ didn't say anything, let them be. But he's saying you have violated the ultimate trust. The only way we can reintegrate you is if you become, the predominant faith, because at this time Islam is growing. But then you have to, dismantle this suburb that you have and live amongst us. So this is the house of an Aus, this is the house of the Khazraj, this is the house of somebody that used to be of Bani Qurayza, this is the house of the Muhajir, etc. So, you're spread out amongst us. So they refused that. Anyway, when they entered into the city, they found 1,500 swords, 2,000 spears, and 3,000 shields. So not only were they colluding with the enemy, but they were also planning to attack Medina from their vantage, from their strategic point, once the other side, the Ghatafan and the Qurayshis, also attacked. So there would have been like an attack on two fronts. Between 600 and 700 men were killed from Bani Qurayza after the passing of this judgment. And I want to pause here really quickly just to give you two statistics about, and we can revisit this at the end of the Sirah, about the battles and the body count throughout the life of the Prophet ﷺ. So in the 120 months that the Prophet ﷺ lived in Medina, so we're talking about the 10 years that the Prophet ﷺ lived in Medina, there were a total of 80 battles. The Prophet ﷺ went out in 27 of them, but only fought in 7 of them. So when we in the Sirah go over battle by battle, that doesn't necessarily mean that there was bloodshed or actual fighting, but it was like a military excursion that was armed. But the majority of them, there was no fighting. And the total body count of everyone that died in the battles of Islam from the time of Medina to the death of the passing of the Prophet ﷺ, 300 Muslims died, and about 700 from the Quraysh died. Meaning that the majority would have been from this incident of Bani Qurayza. That's just to put things in perspective. Now, to understand what that means, as Americans, for example, look at the body counts from individual battles during the Civil War. Look at the body count at the Battle of Gettysburg or the Battle of Antietam, which are the top 2 bloodiest battles. Look at the people that perished in World War I, World War II. Look at how many people died in Vietnam. The things that we would be most familiar with that our country was involved in, and you will understand these statistics are unheard of. As a matter of fact, these statistics are even unheard of in antiquity. So if you go backwards and you look at the Roman Empire and you look at how big the legions were and the brigades and how many people died in this battle or that battle during the Roman Empire, even before Christianity, these numbers would be a rounding error compared to the body count. So this body count is very, very low, extremely low, which underscores everything that we understand about our Prophet ﷺ from a value point of view. We'll come back to those later in the Sirah. I just wanted to throw that out there. One woman was killed amongst the men, and that is because during the siege, she killed a companion, and his name was Khalad ibn Suwayd. And that's also an important detail of the Sirah. So that was, like a capital crime. So she killed somebody, so she died because of that. But other than that, all of the women and the children were spared. And included in those that perished was Hayy ibn Akhtab, who was the father of Lady Safiya, who was the wife of the Prophet ﷺ, who we talked about, I think, in the beginning of the Medina story. She had become Muslim when she was a tiny girl, overhearing her father and her uncle describing the Messenger of Allah ﷺ, and she said, at that time, I believed, and at that time, I fell in love with you. And then she grows up a Muslim in a Jewish household, and then later becomes public about her Islam, and the Prophet ﷺ marries her. So her father died amongst these. But the majority of the population, number-wise, was spared. So even though the body count is high, it's also important to recognize that there were some men who were spared because they were found not to have colluded with the enemy. So this wasn't a blanket execution, but rather this was a court proceeding in which it had to be proven that these people were colluding. And it just happened that the majority of them did. But there were those that did not, and they were set free. The Prophet ﷺ distributes the spoils from Bani Qurayza, so this is a massive victory right after the Battle of the Ditch. From this, the Prophet ﷺ married Rayhana, who some of the ulama counter as one of the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, others counter as a slave. But we go with the opinion that she was one of the wives, a free woman. She was freed, and then the Prophet ﷺ married her, so she's considered our mother, alayhi salam. I mentioned that Sa'd passes away, radiallahu anhu, but don't forget we have one open issue, which is Abu Lubaba. All of this is poor Abu Lubaba is still tied up in the mosque. Finally, the revelation comes with his tawbah. This is verse 27 of Surah Al-Anfal, and also verse 102 of the Tawbah. And then the Prophet ﷺ came and untied him, and he was forgiven. And this entire episode of Bani Qurayza lasted 25 days. So we have the month of essentially the Battle of the Ditch, followed after that the month of Bani Qurayza. And all of this, by the way, is in the year 5 of the Hijrah. Just a few more things before we wrap up today's discussion. There was another Jew from amongst the citizens of Medina. His name was Salam ibn Abi al-Haqiq, and he was from the Jews of Khaybar. And Khaybar was even further than Bani Qurayza. And he was wealthy, and he had openly spent money arming the armies against Medina, also openly critical, not critical, that's the wrong word, openly cursing and declaring his hatred of the Prophet ﷺ and desire to kill the Prophet ﷺ. Because if I say critical, then people are going to think that you can't be critical. That's not what we're talking about. So the Prophet ﷺ said he also needs to go, but only him, not the whole people, not like Bani Qurayza. So the Prophet ﷺ is looking to his companions who will go on this. This is like a commando type mission, because Khaybar is like another city that makes up part of the state. It's very fortified, it's populated, but they're only after one person. They're not after a large group of people. So the Khazraj, they wanted the opportunity to do this because the Aus had taken care of Bani Qurayza. So the Prophet ﷺ agreed, and he gave the command of this small group of 5 companions to Abdullah ibn Atiq radiallahu anhu. The Prophet ﷺ gives him explicit orders not to harm any women, not to harm any children, not to do anything except to go after the Salam ibn Abi Haqiq. This is a very elaborate story in which they sneak into the city. So Abdullah ibn Atiq, he's like by the gate of Khaybar before it closes, and he's like pretending like he's relieving himself. So the person at the gate, the gatekeeper, doesn't see him. And, there's no Facebook at this time or Instagram, so you're not really sure who's who at this time. So he says, "Aren't you going to come in? Hurry up, because I'm going to close this." So they sneak in, and they spend several nights, and it's like a commando. It's like special ops, literally special ops, operation. Some of the narration says that he does it by himself. The other narration says that all 5 of them. The important thing is they find Salam, they kill him, but Abdullah ibn Atiq breaks his leg in the process. So he kills him. They go back to Medina. They ride back. It's like 140, 150 kilometers. It's quite a distance at that time. And then the Prophet ﷺ, he says to Abdullah, "Show me your leg." He sees his leg. He wipes over his leg, and his leg is healed. He says it was as if nothing ever happened. So it's one of the miracles of the Prophet ﷺ. Okay, this was right after Bani Qurayza. Now we are in Muharram, the 10th of Muharram in the year 6 of the Hijrah. So now we're advancing one more year. This was the operation of Muhammad bin Salama, in which 30 riders went out towards the Najd, east towards the Najd. There's a problem that's growing in the Najd, which is Musaylama the liar, Musaylama al-Kadhdhab. Musaylama is the one who made a claim that he's a prophet. Right? That's why he's called Musaylama al-Kadhdhab. And by the way, if for those of you who actually are listening, who kills Musaylama al-Kadhdhab? Later in, Oh, mashallah. So I have to give you come and get your reward. The bookmark. In all honesty, a sister gave me these to pass out, so I'm just okay. Wahshay. Remember we talked about Wahshay. Wahshay kills Hamza, the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ, and we talked about how he has a very interesting life in the future. But with the same spear that he killed Hamza, the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ, he also kills Musaylama the liar later, after the passing of the Prophet. Very good. So this Musaylama, guy, he's brewing this problem in the eastern part of the Arabian Peninsula, and the Prophet ﷺ wanted to put some pressure there. So they go to this area, and the enemies scatter, so there's no skirmish. The 30 riders gather the supplies, the booty, and they capture one person, and his name is Thumama ibn Athad al-Hanafi. And he was the one trying to kill the Prophet ﷺ on behalf of Musaylama the liar. So they bring him back to Medina, and they tie him up. This must have been a very common thing. So they tied him up in a post in the mosque. And then the Prophet ﷺ, he comes out to him, 3 days later, he's like, so he basically says, "What's up? What's going on?" And then Thumama says, "If you kill me, you would have killed blood. If you forgive me, then you'll find me to be generous." He just keeps repeating the same sentiment. And after the 3rd day, the Prophet ﷺ frees him. Now remember, this is somebody who belongs to Dajjalic figure claiming to be a prophet, and also sending this guy to kill the prophet, our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? So after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam frees him, after those 3 days, Thumama becomes Muslim. And he says, Wallahi, there was nobody more that I hated more than you. And now there is nobody that I love more than you. There is no face that I hated to see more than your face. And now there is no face that I love to see more than your face. He addresses the Prophet in this most beautiful of ways, and he's one of the Sahaba radiallahu anhu. It's very powerful, because this sentiment happens frequently throughout the Sirah, in which people have this hatred towards the Prophet ﷺ, but they really don't know why. They're sort of just programmed to hate. And then the minute they see him and they actually interact with him, they fall in love with him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this was the excursion of Muhammad ibn Salama in the 10th of Muharram. And then a few months later, in Rabi' al-Awwal, also in the 6th year of the Hijrah, this was the skirmish of Banu Lahyan, and we'll end with this. Banu Lahyan is an area near Mecca. So this is something that the Prophet ﷺ did not want to touch, because they were responsible for killing some of the companions during the Battle of the Rajia, which we talked about several weeks ago. But because they are physically close to Mecca, the Prophet ﷺ didn't want to attack them, because for obvious reasons he didn't want to stir problems with Mecca. But now that the gloves were coming off and the Prophet ﷺ was trying to put more pressure on the Qurayshis, he sent a group of the companions to them. He went himself this time, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is a big it's a big demonstration that the Prophet ﷺ himself is coming basically to the Meccans. Again, no fighting happens, the enemy disperse, they collect spoils and supplies and things like that. The Prophet ﷺ stayed there for 2 days, and then he returned to Medina. And there are several other minor skirmishes of the same caliber of what we have mentioned today. We don't have to go into the details. But this now shows that the Prophet ﷺ, after the Battle of the Ditch, he had said, now we will fight them in their territory. Next year, that's what the Prophet ﷺ, that's how we ended with the Battle of the Ditch. So now the Prophet ﷺ is going out to be more, to put more pressure on the enemy. And we'll pick up the conversation next week, inshallah. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam. Any questions? We have a little bit of time before about this or anything else. Yeah.
You gave some numbers about how many Muslims and non-Muslims were killed during all the battles. Did you include in those numbers the people who were killed because of treason, or that's separate?
I have to verify that.
Oh, okay.
I think this is people that were lost in the actual battle.
Yeah.
But I have to verify that. Yeah.
In your khutbah,
The Eid khutbah?
yeah, you used Fred Arrestor to torture our Bengali brothers or North African brothers.
I use what?
You used them to torture us.
Who?
Fred Arrestor.
Fred Astaire,
yeah.
How is that torture? Why is that torturing?
They could not place him.
But the people who know who that is, that's who I was speaking to.
What figure will you use next to torture us?
No torture. It's personal. My personal. It's something that's true.
it's famous.
But whoever understood that, those are the people I'm speaking to.
Can you repeat it?
I
want to be tortured.
Yeah.
I like Fred Astaire.
You can listen to
The audio's not there.
I realized that there were people that have no idea what I was talking about. Either that or the Lorax. But that's okay.
But the context helped. You explained the context. So, a question about non-Muslims that were in this city. Were there any Christians? Were there Hindus? What sort of non-Muslims? Were they pagans?
In Medina, there were pagans, Jews, and Muslims.
No Christians.
No, not indigenous. Christians would come from either the north, the Levant, or Yemen. there were some Christians in Mecca, but also not indigenous. At the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there was like 3 or 4 Christians, people, not like 3 or 4 groups, 1, 2, 3 Christians, period. There were like Lady Khadija's cousin, and there was a religious movement, what we call Hanafism, which were the people of Mecca that somehow wanted to adhere to the original religion of Abraham. Because of all of the Hajj rites, the pilgrimage rites, Mecca, the Kaaba and all of that, which was essentially monotheism, but without like some way of practice. It was just sort of like a philosophy. But there were really no Christians in Arabia, in the central part of Arabia. It was really the north and the south.
But the pagans coexisted with Muslims in Medina?
Yes, in the beginning part of Medina, up until this, what we're talking about now, we're in the year 6. Up until that time, yeah, there were pagan tribes in Medina that coexisted with the Muslims. As far as the Dharmic faith, Islam didn't encounter that until it went past the Oxus River in the east. Maybe in Persia, or actually maybe before that, maybe when the Muslims went to Persia, they encountered, of course, Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, Mazdism, some of these other, but they're not really Dharmic faiths. The Dharmic faiths, Buddhism, Hinduism, all that comes much, much later, when the Muslims enter in India, which I think is maybe 400 years after the life of the prophets, if I remember correctly. I think it's in the year 1000 of the Christian era, I think, but I may be wrong.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What happened to the remaining members of Banu Qurayza?
Yeah, I don't know what happened to the Jews of Medina. We don't really know. I think that some of them convert and therefore assimilate.
Do they remain in their?
No, but the majority of them leave. I think they go think they go north. But I don't know. And I actually, I remember thinking, or a rabbi telling me, that the only thing that Jews know about the Jews of Arabia are from Muslim sources. I don't think there are any other non-Muslim sources, or maybe 1 or 2, that speak about what we're talking about. So I don't know. We don't know. I mean, meaning not that it's unknown. I just don't know. I mean, maybe we could look into it and find out. But I know that some of them convert, and then the rest are forced to leave. Yeah. Sorry, I'm forced to leave, not because they're Jews, like these groups that have violated the contract leave, but there are Jews that remain. Even the Prophet, up until the time he died, he had Jewish neighbors. So there was no eradication of like Judaism. I mean, over time, the attrition. Yeah, attrition. But when we say that they were forced to leave, I'm only talking about the people that violated, like Bani Qurayza, Khaybar, we'll talk about later, things like that. Sorry.
No, it's fine. I just had a question about the death count for Banu Qurayza. So I know the accepted number in many Sirah books, Ibn Ishaq and many other popular ones, is 600. But like from my own study, if I'm remembering this correctly, Imam Malik, radiallahu anhu, he questioned the number of the casualties. And then he did it because he didn't like
Bani Qurayza?
Yeah, Banu Qurayza.
Sure, yeah.
Because,
I don't know.
I mean, he has multiple reasons. 1, he didn't like Ibn Ishaq that much. And 2, he questioned his methodology. According to him, I have no idea about this, is just what I've read. He said that Ibn Ishaq relied too much on Jewish sources for the casualty numbers. And when you're the victim of a attack, it's natural to like inflate.
Do you have a reference? I don't know that.
I can find it. I've read it a while ago.
Yeah, but understand that everything we know about Ibn Ishaq comes through the filter of Ibn Hisham.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't have any extant actual manuscript of Ibn Ishaq's Sirah.
Yeah.
And Ibn Hisham is known. And not only is Ibn Hisham known, but Ibn Hisham's Sirah, which is the mother of Sirahs, has also been edited and commented on, and so yeah, if the number is less, great.
I mean, he's the He's the only one I know that question,
Okay.
and he's not a small name, so that's why I brought it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we just present like mainstream sources, but if there are little commentaries and edits and nuances here and there, that's great. I mean, all of this doesn't add or subtract to our practice of Islam. So it's all, if there's another opinion, that's fine.
Yeah, it's just for people who are uncomfortable.
Yeah, like Rayhana, some people say that, I think Ibn Hafs says that she was a slave.
Yeah.
And I think it's Ibn Hisham that said that the Prophet, or others, no, not Ibn Hisham, another Sirah scholar said that the Prophet freed her and married her. So I said, oh, I'm going to go with that. He freed her and married her. So, anybody else?
Just have a question about the money that was used, the coins. Did any of them have images of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam on them at all?
No, but the coins that the Prophet and the Sallallahu used and the companions, they had crosses on them because they were Roman. Yeah. So, and the reason I know this is that one time when I made these codes, these bracelets that have the Star of David. So I asked the Mufti, I said, do you think this is okay? And that's what he told me. So the Prophet had coins in his pocket that had crosses on them. And that's how I never even thought about that. So the Muslims didn't mint money until the Umayyads. Like with La ilaha illallah. But when the Muslims minted money, the early Muslims, I mean, it was just La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. And maybe like the name of like the caliph or something like that. The image is not something that, it doesn't come until much, much later. Sorry. And everything that we have in the Sharia that talks about the dinar and the dirham, the original weight, like when somebody says, well, what is the zakat nisab? How much is when the zakat counter starts? It's 85 grams of 21 karat gold, of that gold. So the Roman dinar is what the Sharia is based on, not the Umayyad or something that comes later. So to understand exactly what the Sharia talks about when it comes to numismatics, we have to go back to what was used at that time, which was Roman, which is very interesting. And there are some ulama that tracked all of this stuff down and weighed them and got the weight down and documented them. They tracked it on different museums. It's actually very fascinating. That was the one class I avoided like the plague at Princeton. It was Islamic numismatics. I just thought it was a waste of time. I know I regret it, but the exams, they just show you a picture of a coin. You're supposed to like tell them. I don't have time for that. I don't have time for that. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, this is about the Muhammad where you said about like Tarek Elgawhary, the two interpretations are correct.
Yeah.
How that translates other hadiths and stuff like that. Like how like language that could be interpreted both ways. Is there like an extent, or did the Prophet Muhammad say anything about interpretation in general about hadiths and like? So I feel like people could obviously abuse that, right? Like abuse interpretation of hadiths in such a way that like, like him saying that like both ways are interpreted, like are there extents to which like people could use that? Like did he give any precautions on how to interpret hadiths or anything like that beyond that one occurrence?
Yes, he did, because the interpretation in Islam is based on first principles. So Islam is all based on first principles. So the Prophet ﷺ said if somebody adds something to Islam that violates our first principles, then that's rejected. So one of the principles is language. So the Prophet ﷺ said, don't pray Asr until you get to Bani Qurayza. So the way that both groups interpreted that, the language can hold both meanings. Like if I told you, if we walked into the mosque and I say, can you turn on the lights? And you switched one or two switches and not the other. I can't say that you didn't, follow what I told you to do, because you did. What I meant was, then I would say, no, I mean, can you turn on all the lights? And the reason this is foreign for us is because we're very lazy when we speak. And that's one of the not only the criticisms of modern education, but also the criticism specifically of American English, is that we are very lazy and not precise. The Sahaba, when the Prophet ﷺ spoke, they were very precise. Arabic is a very precise, it's like a surgical language, used by them, not used by modern Arabs, also don't know how to speak, but I mean, used by the Prophet ﷺ. So when we want to understand interpretation, the first thing we have to do is we have to go backwards with language. So what did that word mean back then? What was the usage of the word back then? And that's why a large part of Arabic studies is the preservation of Jahili poetry, because Jahili poetry is also another source of how words were used. Keeping in mind that only about 10 to 14%, the Quran and the Hadith only contain less than 20% of the entire Arabic language. So the Arabic language is much, much larger than the Arabic that's used in the Quran and the Sunnah. So anyway, yes, there are parameters because there are first principle hadiths that the Prophet ﷺ would say, la darar wa la dirar, there's no harming or causing harm. That's a principle. It's a hadith, but it's also a principle. إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, all actions are based on intention. That hadith that, Imam Shafi'i says that it has to do with over 70 chapters of Islamic law. So there are these like paradigmatic hadiths, and the ulama that studied this, they catalog these principles, and they say these are our legal principles based on these hadith, based on these verses, and then they begin to sketch a paradigm of how we can interpret the Quran and Sunnah so we don't abuse it. But the most important, or the first step, is obviously language. And that's why a lot of people now are like, oh, the hijab is not in the Quran, or inheritance, what God really meant to say is, things like that. No, we can't, that's not how interpretation goes, because then I can make the verses mean whatever I want. So to understand this word in the Quran, I gotta go back. And when you go back to the dictionaries and the usage, sometimes you find that the word actually means 5 different things at the same time. As any word in any language. And I recently acquired the Oxford English Dictionary, the 20-volume, Oxford. And when you look at that, it's fascinating. You find the same thing in English. Words evolve and their meanings evolve, and they have multiple usage, and one word can mean multiple different things. That's just the nature of language. And Arabic is no different.
Did it have the word selfie in
I have not looked at that. Selfie, I should try that. So that's what I'm going to do tonight.
Sheikh, one of the fascinating stories that I have heard about this Battle of Bridge is, this tells me about the character of Prophet ﷺ, that how he had no ego or he was willing to accept, is that when they were strategizing the battle, I think it was someone Farsi or some other Sahabi that asked him, are you giving these instructions as a prophet or as a common person? And when he was saying that, no, this is not as a prophet, as a common person, then he said, this may not be the best strategy, maybe we should do this. Is that true?
Yes, but that was not in the Battle of the Ditch, that was another battle. That was the position of the water in Uhud, in which the Prophet ﷺ said that. But in the Battle of the Ditch, it was Salman al-Farsi who offered he said in Persia, this is how the Persians deal with this, and they adopted it. Yeah, so the Prophet ﷺ adopted foreign stratagems, concepts. He wore different clothes, foreign clothes, things like that. The Prophet ﷺ was open to the world, and therefore the Sunnah is open to the world, which is why we can live the Sunnah and live out the Sunnah in any environment. And the Prophet ﷺ himself, he said, "Al-hikmatu dalatul mu'min," that wisdom is the lost property of the believer. So the position that we have is that when we find something that's smart, that belongs to me. So Muslims didn't burn books, didn't ban books. Muslims learned everything. They learned other languages. They learned black magic. They learned how to play string instruments to be able to sound out the different maqams of how poetry is recited, so they could recite the Quran that way. All of the scientific discoveries that the Muslim scientists, they were ulama themselves. So our attitude towards knowledge is we have a unquenched thirst to know and to explore. And throughout our histories, there's never been any problem with anything. Aristotle, everything that we know today about Aristotle and Plato is only because Muslims translated those works and used them and commented on them, etc. That's the only way we know antiquity. Islam was the bridge for Europe of their own antiquity tradition. So that speaks a lot. And this is not something that one person did. This is generation after generation after generation of Muslim thinkers, meaning that this is part of our DNA of how Muslims are. And why? Is because this is how the Prophet ﷺ himself was. Build a ditch, build a pyramid. I just want to win. It's no big deal.
Can I ask an Aqidah question at this time?
This will be the last question, because I think we have to pray soon. Yeah.
Right. This is something I was thinking about doing Ramadan. So, you brought up the issue of interpretation, and the one issue that's like you've said multiple times as key is we reject anthropomorphism. That should be obvious. I mean, you shouldn't have to tell us that, but I mean, sadly you do. But so when we approach the quote unquote anthropomorphous verses in the Quran, like Yadullah, Wajhallah, when do we do ta'wil on those verses and say like the yad, like the hand represents the power of Allah, or do we say like, oh, it's a hand, but it's unlike any other hand in creation? And do you understand what I'm saying? Or like,
Yeah, whatever you need to tell yourself so you don't misunderstand it is essentially the answer. I mean, some people they read these things and they stress out. They're like, what does this mean? So that person be like, yeah, that's a metaphor for power, that's a metaphor for possession, that's a metaphor for majesty, that's a metaphor for mercy. That's what ta'wil is.
Mhm.
But the Salaf, they're like, whatever, man. I mean, obviously God doesn't have a hand. I don't even think about God having a hand, because I know God doesn't have a hand. So I just read the verse and I go to the next verse. So it's really a personal thing, like what you need, what the person needs. There are some people that, like I said, they really can't. They're like stuck, like Ibn Taymiyyah. I mean, Ibn Taymiyyah could have been saved by just somebody sitting down and like, yo, man, just chill out. God's not sitting on the chair, and this chair is squeaking. Some of the Salafis, they say that God sits on his throne and the throne squeaks when he sits on it. I mean, there's nothing more a statement of disbelief than that. So the ta'wil stuff is just what works for you. That's my personal.
I mean, personally, this stuff I don't really care that much about. I mean, it just says it, and it's like, I mean, obviously, I don't think Allah has a hand or sits on a chair.
But all of the later Sunnis, they all talk about the ta'wil. I mean, so I would just go with that.
Mm.
Okay, can someone? You want to ask something, or you have?
Wait, do you have a collection of just those principal hadiths you were talking about, those overarching ones?
Well, the 40 hadith of Imam al-Nawawi,
Yeah.
that would start with that. Those are,
I have all of those.
and then Imam al-Ghazali has an Arba'in for Usul al-Din. I think it's translated into English. So he has 40 like hadith that are, or 40 principles.
That's enough to start.
And then the principles theme on the podcast, those are also, I think there's a total of 30 or 35. I still have like 10 more to go. But all of those are principles. I'm actually thinking of just sending the audio to a transcription service and getting them all transcribed and then putting them as a PDF. But those are all like paradigmatic also principles.
Thank you.
Okay. Wallahu a'lam. Can someone call that in?